Tom Koulopoulos is chairman and founder of the Delphi Group, a Boston-based think tank that focuses on how technology is shaping the future. He is also the past executive director of the Babson College Center for Business Innovation, a professor at Boston University, an inventor with numerous patents, and the author of 14 books. Right, welcome, Tom. Great to have you on the show today. And today the focus is going to be on one of your many books. This one is your latest book. It's called Gigatrends, and it's an amazing book. I've been carrying it around with me throughout the house every day. It's become kind of a compendium of facts and knowledge. So I've been very excited to work my way through it. And, it's just a fascinating piece. You're looking out to the year 2100. So there's just so much to unpack today. Let's start with the book is called Gigatrends again. Here's a copy. And at the end of the show, we'll talk about where folks can order the book and how to contact you. But let's start with even the term gigatrend. I know there's a lot of trends out there. There's disruptive trends, there's strategic technology trends, and now gigatrends. Can you help the audience kind of unpack those, and how are you defining gigatrends?
Sure. I mean, it's a great place to start. But before we go there, thanks for having me on the show. And thanks for carrying the book around with you all the time. That's wonderful to hear. I don't know how everyone else in the household reacts to your having Gigatrends with you 24/7, but I'm happy that you are anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot in the book. It was definitely one of my most enjoyable projects that I've done to date. Nathaniel and I, my co-author, really spent a lot of time thinking through what these gigatrends were going to be. And I know we're going to talk about each of them individually, but there's so many more trends that we could have covered. And we picked these 6 because we thought they would be the most influential to 1 billion or more people. And that's where the term gigatrend comes from. These are trends that are going to affect billions of people, literally everyone on the planet at some point or another. So a gigatrend is a trend that is foundational. It is the basis for so many other trends, so many other technologies, social behaviors come out of these gigatrends. And if you look back historically, we can think of gigatrends that initially were point solutions, but turned into enormous socio-economic phenomenon. One example we use in the book very early on is radio. Radio waves and radio transmission, which today surrounds us, was initially a point-to-point mechanism used on the battlefield to communicate important information that was relevant when you were in a war. And it wasn't thought of as a broadcast medium. And yet the broadcast ability of radio has truly changed the world. And frankly, if there's one technology that probably everyone on the planet today is somehow exposed to, it is radio transmission in one form or another. The small portable transistor radio that Sony, I think, sold well over 8 or 9 billion of these small transistor radios. It was one of the most successful products in history, techno products in history, until the iPhone came along. And smartphones kind of took the lead in terms of pervasive devices that are out there. But that transistor radio, I had one as a kid. It was my connection to society. When I would travel to other parts of the world, I remember using that radio to connect with, through shortwave, with things back home long before the internet existed. So gigatrends are those kinds of phenomenon that truly change the way that we live our lives. And one of the most telling aspects of gigatrends is that we look back on them and we wonder how civilization could have possibly survived without this, fill in the blank, whatever this is. How could we have built a society without harnessing radio transmission? And they're that powerful. And they also come along at a point where as a society, we most need them. So you can make a case, again, using the example of radio, that without radio transmission, we wouldn't have been able to build this sort of society that we have today, but we also wouldn't have been able to overcome many of the challenges that we had as we grew as a population, as we grew as a civilization. So gigatrends are essential. They are, in some cases, the way that we build a society, and in other cases, the way that the society survives the challenges that it's faced with. So they're fascinating. We're often oblivious to them when we're in the midst of the gigatrend, and yet when we look back, they become very obvious.
With the gigatrend, is it just the fact that it's impacting 1 billion people, or are there some other attributes of the gigatrend that make it such? And also, is it something that some of them, like the aging population or population changes, maybe are they just happening, or are there actors and agents behind some of these trends, or innovators and entrepreneurs, obviously,
Yeah.
behind most of these trends? But how do you kind of dissect some of these? Some of them are just part of life, right? There's just natural evolution, and others are kind of kicked into gear by certain entrepreneurs or large organizations. So, what's the mix look like, and
Yeah.
so on?
So you bring up a few interesting questions, and let me sort of deconstruct what you just asked into at least three different parts. Gigatrends are certainly foundational, as I said, but they also include a lot of interaction with each other and with other trend lines that are evolving socially. So if we look at the first gigatrend we talk about, the demographic shift, population is changing, we're getting older as a globe, but that has enormous implications on so many other parts of the world. So how do we fund social welfare? How do we provide health care to this aging population that has more complexity in their care, increasing volume of therapeutics, genomic medicine? All of that fits into this gigatrend of demographic change. So gigatrends never happen in isolation. They are very much woven into the fabric of our society. So they're highly interconnected. So when I say foundational, it tends to imply that everything else is built on top of that foundation. Perhaps a better way to think about this is that it is the infrastructure of the entirety of this, whatever we're building on this foundation. It stretches through it. It's not just the base of it. It is part of every aspect of that architecture. So it's woven into our society very, very tightly. And that's important to understand, because they're not isolated trends. They are trends that very much are complex and affect so many aspects of how we live, we work, and play. The second piece of your question, which is interesting, I believe, is that these gigatrends are long-term trends. They don't happen over the course of a few years, or even necessarily, a few decades. They happen over centuries, and their implication is long and very far into the future. So a gigatrend doesn't happen over the course of 12 months or even 12 years. It happens over the course of 100 years, and it evolves. It grows over that period of time. And this brings me to your third point, which is, who are the players and the influencers that cause these gigatrends to occur? So there's two schools of thought to this, and they're both quite fascinating, and they're not exclusive one to the other. The first school of thought is that someone comes along, like an Elon Musk, and creates this gigatrend. Autonomous vehicles, perhaps. We talk about transportation a great deal in the book, and how that is part of the gigatrend that's going to shape long-term our society. But the other school of thought is that the gigatrend would happen regardless. It just so happens that someone comes along as the catalyst to accelerate it and to move it forward. I'm much more of the opinion that the latter is typically the way gigatrends evolve, and someone does come along to accelerate this, to sort of add fuel to the fire of the gigatrend, but someone would have anyway. No one person is responsible for the evolution of AI, for example. We love as human beings to create the founder, the person who initially planted the seed, but the reality is there are many seeds that are usually planted. We love the Einsteinian view of the world. If it wasn't for Einstein, we wouldn't have relativity. And while I would never take anything away from the brilliance of an Einstein or a Ford, if you will, or a Bell, or whoever you want to use as a prototype of that brilliant mind that sort of is the spark that ignites the flame, the embers were there. Something would have ignited the flame. Something would have caused AI to become as relevant as it is today. It just so happens that there are people who carry the mantle of innovation and take the risk, as Musk has, and bring us face to face with very tactical aspects of how that gigatrend is going to evolve. And that's what we're seeing right now with AI. It's becoming very tactical. You can see it, you can feel it, you can use it on a day-to-day basis. And I think it also speaks to how, as human beings, we need someone to be the torchbearer of that gigatrend. We need someone to, Alexander Bell was the torchbearer, Ford was the torchbearer, Musk is the torchbearer. We need that torchbearer. As human beings, we like that. It appeals to us. But the reality is that the evolution, the innovation would have happened regardless. Someone would have been the torchbearer. It just happens that historically, we have these icons that we use and we refer to, and it makes it easier for us to identify when the genesis of that gigatrend was. But so much was brewing long before any of the current players gained any notoriety. AI goes back to, AI is woven through so many of these gigatrends. AI goes back to literally the time when I was born, the 1950s. People, Alan Turing was talking about AI in terms that are very familiar to us today in terms of what it could do, and the fact that someday we would have this entity that would be as smart as or smarter than human beings. So it takes a long time to sort of pour the footings of these gigatrends. But when they accelerate, and this is critical, and this is where, to your last point, where the catalytic players are important, when it finally begins to take off, it takes off very quickly. And it always surprises us how quickly it takes off. But it does so because there is a long period during which that gigatrend has been simmering, waiting for social, economic, geopolitical factors to launch it. And that's, I think, where we are today with many of these gigatrends. We are finally at the launching point where the technology is in place. We have the need for these gigatrends to take on some of the enormous challenges we have as a society. And frankly, the time is right for them. So a lot of confluence in how a gigatrend evolves, the period over which it impacts us as a society, as a civilization, and the role of these catalytic players in accelerating it when the time finally comes that gigatrend is going to launch. It really is fascinating to think about how these gigatrends evolve and the impact that they have. And that was part of the fun of writing the book, was looking carefully at how some of these trends are going to have an impact on us, again, over the next 80 years through the end of this century, but also in the next 10 years. Every single one of the gigatrends we talk about is having an impact today. Healthcare, which is the second gigatrend we talk about, ambient care. The healthcare system we have today in the US and frankly globally is not going to survive. The aging demographic, again, gigatrend building on gigatrend, right? The first gigatrend of the aging demographic is simply not going to allow healthcare as it is today to survive. It's impossible to treat an aging population with the degree of care that they will need, given the current healthcare system that we have in the US and around the world. No social welfare system is possibly going to be able to deal with the enormous complexity of this aging population. And the entire globe is aging. It's not just the US, it's not just the European Union, it's not just Great Britain, it's not just Australia. The entire globe is aging, with a couple of exceptions, which are interesting. And I'm going to leave those because we'll come back to those when we talk about demographics, because there are some geographic anomalies here, which are on the one hand frightening and on the other hand quite encouraging. But I'm gonna leave that until we get to that gigatrend, Nick.
Okay, great. So that you're triggering so many questions here. So I think, or observations too. I think one, it's good that we're looking at these moonshot style disruptive innovations, because there's so much focus on tactical near-term innovation. It's great to see the focus on this broader scale, more disruptive innovation, and kind of looking at the moonshots and some of the entrepreneurs that are making the big bets. So that's very encouraging. And one of the questions that you tackle in the book in the first chapter was why the future is so hard to predict.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about this this notion of clocks and clouds. And so maybe that's something you can explain for the audience and tell us a little bit about not only why the future is so hard to predict, but also how did you tackle that? Because you actually looked out till the year 2100, and most of us are pretty hesitant about and nervous about trying to predict beyond 3 years. We do the 3-year strategic plan, maybe if we're ambitious, we do a 5-year business strategy. But even 10 years is frightening to most people. So,
Right.
I apologize for kind of a two-part question,
No,
but
no.
why the future is so hard to predict, and then how did you go about it,
So
looking out that far?
I love all aspects of that question. But let me respond first in a somewhat counterintuitive way. I would submit that at this point where we are right now, while it feels like the future is exceptionally difficult to predict, I would submit that the long-term future is actually becoming easier to predict. And that sounds like anathema. It sounds like arrogance. It's not arrogance. This is not me saying I can predict the future, or I and my co-author Nathaniel can predict the future because we have a crystal ball. Not at all. And I'll come back to why I think it will be easier to predict the future as we go forward. But hold that thought, and let me come back to the first part of your question. Why has it been so difficult to predict the future? And there are some conventional answers here. That socioeconomic, political shifts are difficult to predict and to anticipate. So much of our world today and the complexity of it is nearly impossible for us to anticipate. And I think we feel that. We feel we've entered an era of great uncertainty. I remember back in 2001, after the attacks of 9/11, speaking with Peter Drucker, who was a great mentor of mine for about 10 years, and asking Peter, this is the man who was the father of modern management. He had lived, nearly 100 years, and he had worked with world leaders, with CEOs of the Fortune 500. He was a brilliant and incredibly humble gentleman. And I remember asking him, Peter, what do you think we're in store for? And my question was really more short-term related. When will we pull out of the sort of collective depression and anxiety that we currently feel in the wake of 9/11? And Peter's response to me was, Tom, I think we're entering an era of prolonged uncertainty, not cyclical short-term uncertainty, but prolonged uncertainty. And my goodness, 24, 25 years later, he was absolutely right. We have seen increasing levels of uncertainty in so many aspects of the world. And we can look at today, the slice of time, and what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on with Russia and the Ukraine, what's going on with China, what may be going on with Taiwan, all of these forces that are so difficult for us to adequately anticipate and to predict. What's going to happen to the U.S. political system, given the current state of divisiveness that we're in? A lot of uncertainty, and it can feel overwhelming at times. I'm going to say something now that will probably be taken as somewhat odd in the context of an individual who does a lot of research, who bases his findings on data. I think as human beings, we've reached our limits in being able to predict the future. And we need AI to help us do that. Frank Knight, one of the least known economists of the last century, the 1900s, wrote a treatise on the role of uncertainty in economics. It's it's a difficult book to read, unless you're an economist, but it's a fascinating book because Frank Knight's premise was that the whole purpose of human consciousness was to predict the future. Stop and think about that for a minute. Right now, what you're doing when you listen to me is trying to predict the next word I'm going to say, kind of like a large language model, right? That's the way we think. When you laugh at humor, when we cry, why do we do that? Why do we show those emotions? Because what happens next is not what we anticipated or expected to happen. So we laugh because it's unanticipated. We cry because we didn't anticipate the grief. As human beings, we're always trying to predict the next moment, next hour, next day, next year, next decade. We're wired to do that. When you take that away from us, we suddenly feel lost. Any certainty is greater than uncertainty. Even if that certainty is a worst case scenario, we prefer that to uncertainty. So we're at a point now, think about this and think about it deeply. We're at a point now where the world is so incredibly complex, so intricately woven together that we cannot predict how this house of cards, this stack of sticks, whatever analogy you want to use, is going to react when we move one little twig or touch one card in the house of cards. And I would submit that as a result of that, we desperately need AI to help us with that predictive capability, both in the short term. And now I get very tactical. How will this machine fail? When will it fail? When will the commercial truck need to be repaired so I can send out the repairman before it breaks down on the roadside? To the long term, how will the future evolve, given the fact that we can't even begin to predict the next, as you said, next 2-3 years? AI will be an essential collaborator in helping us to establish a future that is more predictable. Now, I'm not saying it'll be precisely predictable. That'll never be the case. I think that there needs to be friction, and there needs to be chaos, because from that comes innovation. Society evolves, our organizations evolve, we evolve because of the challenges that we're faced with. No one evolves as a human being when they're looking at the rainbow and the butterflies. We love that. We love to watch the sunset and be in awe of it, but that's not when we grow. We grow when we are challenged. So I think we continue to need challenge and some degree of chaos and churn and friction. But AI will give us as humans the ability to be better predictors of what's going to happen next. And that gives us more bandwidth than as humans to do the creative thing that we humans are really good at. It's a long answer to what sounds like a simple question. But yeah, we've been challenged by predicting the future. We will get better at it. But at the same time, I think we will be a more creative species than we ever have been, a more inclusive species than we ever have been, and frankly, a much more intelligent species than we ever have been because of that ability. So predicting the future is always going to be a bit of a gamble, but the near future will be much easier to predict. And I also think, to pardon the pun, I predict that the long future will become easier to predict as well in some ways. Not 100%, but a bit more than it certainly has been in recent history. Fascinating to think about it that way.
So a question there is, I've heard, I think it was Peter Diamandis was talking about how humans think on a linear basis. So we've been wired to think about if
Right.
a lion is coming to eat us, right? We're looking at the linear distance for the nearest tree versus how far the lion is away, right? So we're just kind of naturally programmed to think about linear distances and time and everything.
Yeah.
And obviously the future can be quite exponential and things. I think I've heard you mention this, that we kind of what do? We overestimate the near-term impact
Right.
and underestimate the longer-term impact of a technology.
Sure.
So given that, how do you see AI being able to predict the future? I know it's good at the clock type. We'll have to talk about clocks and clouds, but I know it's good at the clock type prediction, where it's engineering, and it can look at the time for mechanical failure of a jet engine with AI/ML, right? Going back to the kind of the old school AI. But what about, I haven't really seen so far that Gen AI is that good at making predictions, because it's looking at historical data. But when I've tried it to make a prediction using Gen AI, it's not really telling me anything super insightful. It just says, cloud computing is going to continue to grow or be popular or whatever it might be, or grow market share.
Right.
So I think you probably know something I don't know, that maybe you can share that with our audience as well, in terms of your thinking there.
I will share all that I know, and I don't think it's necessarily more than any of us know. I just think I'm trying to piece it together, maybe slightly differently. So let's go to clocks and clouds, because that relates to where you were going, and I sidestepped that in the last segment where you asked that question directly. So the idea behind clock problems and cloud problems is that clock problems are highly predictable. They're mechanistic, and it comes from the fact that you can take a clock, smash it against the wall, and if you're relatively intelligent, you can put it back together again. You can see how it worked. You can predict how the different gears would work together. The Antikythera mechanism, which was found in the waters of the Mediterranean, was a device that was used at this point, my goodness, 2,500, maybe 3,000 years ago, to predict the movement of the planets. And the way we know that is because we took this device that had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for thousands of years, And we were able, with radiography and other tools, to look inside of it, to see the gears, see how they worked, and predict what this device would do. That's a clock problem, very mechanistic. And you're absolutely right. AI is fantastic. Machine learning is wonderful at clock problems, like chess. But it's also pretty damn good at intuitive problems like Go, which I would claim is a means by which humans, through intuition, the game of Go, humans through intuition express a predictive ability that goes beyond the mechanistics of chess. There's an enormous number of moves that you can make in chess, equal to perhaps the number of atoms in the universe or some crazy number of that sort. But with Go, if you try to plot on a logarithmic chart the number of moves possible in Go, on a logarithmic chart, that bar would exceed the bounds of the solar system. It will be that big. So there's some ridiculous number of moves in the game of Go that is simply impossible to predict mechanistically. And yet, with AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, Google proved that it could win against Lee Sedol, who was the reigning king of Go, and do it marvelously, and without any challenge whatsoever. So I would challenge the fact that AI is purely mechanistic. I think there are elements of AI that will allow us to be much more novel in those predictions. And that's the cloud piece of this. Cloud problems are not mechanistic. And it comes from the fact that in the cloud, you have trillions upon trillions of molecules interacting in these very crazy ways. I was just speaking with someone yesterday about how in the Northeast, we can't predict the weather. We try to predict it, but we simply can't predict it. Last year, we thought there would be an apocalyptic snowstorm. And on that same weekend that the apocalyptic snowstorm was supposed to occur, we had not a single flake of snow, not one. And everything in the state of Massachusetts had shut down, anticipating this enormous snowstorm, this nor'easter. Nothing happened. How can we be so bad at it with all the technology that we have? And the answer is we're not quite there. Cloud problems are they change. They change on a moment-to-moment basis. However, I do believe that AI will evolve to not necessarily solve the cloud problems, the emergent problems, but to help us as collaborators to work together to better anticipate those problems. So to your point, yes, AI does not predict with novelty and with intuition, but I believe the cornerstones are there with which we can use it to collaborate and together to better predict the future. And that's the piece of it that most folks, I think, don't get about AI. As we move from AI as being strictly task-based, tell me which way the storm is going to, tell me what the track of the storm is going to be, a very task-based approach, to AI as a much more intense agentic collaborator, an agent that works with me, the way that you and I are working together right now to come up with novel conversation. As we move into that realm, I think AI will become much better at helping us to predict that long future. But it's not just AI. And I think we often get into this very dangerous conundrum of it's us or AI. AI will put us out of business. AI, it's not zero sum. It's AI as a collaborator that helps us to better do what humans have always done, which is to express intuition, to reinforce that intuition, to redirect that intuition in a more productive, more efficient, more accurate way. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it. And more and more, we will be faced with these cloud problems, these emergent problems that don't have singular solutions. The cloud problems don't go away, right? They'll still be here. There'll still be many mechanistic clock-based problems that we'll have to solve, and AI will help us with that. Machine learning can help us with that. But we'll increasingly be surrounded by these cloud problems. Going back to what I said earlier about the generalized uncertainty of the world and the degree to which that is increasing, and the magnitude of the problems that we're going to have to solve in this new uncertain context. We need AI as the collaborator in the same way that, and this sounds like a silly analogy, in the same way that a farmer back in the 1800s needed the John Deere plow to pull behind a horse to be able to till the soil. We talk about that in the book, in fact. Without that solution, we couldn't have fed the growing population of the US. Without robotic agriculture, we couldn't have fed the growing population of the world. So we need these technologies to help us survive as a species. AI is one more example of a technology that will help us survive as a species because of the magnitude, the complexity, the scale, and the speed with which these problems are evolving. And then to your last point about exponential growth, we are very linear. We're wired as human beings to think in linear terms. But I think we'll become better at being exponential thinkers. We'll have to become better at being exponential thinkers. And again, AI will be part of the process through which we collaborate with this new species to become better at being exponential in how we think and in predicting the future impact of those exponential changes. And by the way, the chessboard, I might have gotten the math all wrong with that, so forgive me for that. But you know, there is some point in the chessboard where we suddenly run out of money or atoms in the universe to be able to fill that chessboard with pennies. We're very linear, and nature has wired us that way. AI is not. AI will be very exponential in how it thinks, and through our collaboration, I think we'll develop better skills to be able to predict the future in a way that is increasingly nonlinear.
Great. Okay. I think we'll probably come back to AI. I'm sure in every 5 minutes or so throughout the discussion. But let's move on to let's hit on each of the 6 gigatrends that you've identified in the book. We'll start with the future of population.
Right.
And it'd be interesting to hear for the audience kind of a synopsis of the chapter and how you're extrapolating where you see the future of population as you look. And I know in the book you actually have a couple of pages at the end of each chapter where you're kind of breaking it down decade by decade,
right?
And kind of talking about what's going to occur each decade. So maybe give us a sense of the gigatrend around population, and then we'll kind of keep moving through the other 5 as well.
So we picked that as the first gigatrend because we believe it's going to impact every aspect of society, our economy, politics, education, agriculture, everything else we talk about in the book is ultimately going to be impacted by this changing demographic. And to sum it up, the changing demographic means that we move from a population pyramid where you have all the young people at the bottom and the old people at the top, which by and large in the developed world has looked like this for as long as we've kept records. There's been some oscillation, but by and large, it's been a population pyramid. That's where the term comes from. So demographers use this construct of the pyramid to talk about how population changes over time in terms of its profile. What's changing most from about the 1900s up through 2100, which is where we look at the shifting nature of the population demographic globally, is that the pyramid has done something of this sort. So by the time we get to 2100, what we have is a dome. Demographers actually call it the tombstone effect. That's the term that they affectionately use to describe this. And without getting into all the details, because it's difficult without visualization to grasp this, we end up, by the time we get to the 2050s, 2060s, with less than 2 percentage points delta difference between the number of people in the 0 through 5 age band and the 60 through 65 age band in that pyramid. So the sides are almost parallel through those ages. What does that mean? Well, we have funded social welfare with the pyramid. Lots of young folks, lots of working folks that are taking care of this increasingly, smaller and smaller slice of older folks, because that's where most of the money is spent in social welfare. We'll talk about healthcare in a minute, but healthcare is one of those social welfare components. So the question is, how do you fund that? How do you restructure a society to deal with this kind of a demographic as opposed to this kind of a demographic? And the answer is, you can't do it the way we've done it so far. You can't use industrial era methods, economies of scale, to serve that new society because, quite frankly, the planet won't survive the inefficiency of economies of scale. And we'll talk more about this as we talk about dematerialization later on in the book. But the point here is that we have to face this reality of the changing population demographic and answer the question, how are we going to address each of the challenges that it presents to us? And we simply cannot use the same models we've used to build the world as we know it today to serve this new world in this new demographic. And I mentioned earlier that this was global, but there were 2 interesting geographies that departed from the norm, that were aberrations. One of them is China. China has reached peak population. And by 2100, we project out in the book, as you said, up through 2100, it will be at half of the population it's at today, which is quite extraordinary. And that's going to create enormous pressure on China to rethink its economic policies, to rethink its political policies. It's just not clear the way that's going to play out. China has made, at this point, I think well over $3 trillion of investment in other parts of the world, including one part of the world which defies the population demographic I just described, and will continue to be a pyramid up through the year 2100, and that's Africa. Africa will have a perfect population pyramid up to the year 2100. So very early in the book, we start to ask these very difficult questions about what will the world look like with this new demographic, and how do we address some of the core issues like healthcare that will be presented by this core demographic. The other piece of this too, which we talk about in the book, is historically there's been this thing called retirement, right? Where at some point you stop work, you reach the end of your work life. What's fascinating is that if we plot life expectancy, which continues to increase gradually over time, there is an upper limit to life expectancy, but it continues to increase gradually globally over time, and then plot against that work life expectancy, how long we are working, the two actually intersect. Sometime before 2100, your work life intersects with your life expectancy, which means that you're working until you're dead. In many ways, because of AI, you may be working after you're dead. It's a complete construct, and it sounds funny at first, but it's quite literal. I mean, I'm building personas today that I can have conversations with that are avatars of me, but have my entire knowledge base. Those personas will live on. Will that create a digital divide in that global demographic? Will it mean that there are some people like me, like you, who have the ability to leverage things like AI and monetize them and get value from them while others cannot? And we very early in the book start to take on this issue of the other 4 billion, we call it. Because today, 4 billion people out of the 8 billion or so on the planet live on less than $7 a day. How will they leverage these new technologies? How will they become part of the global socioeconomic ecosystem? And the answer is, with the current means we have in place, they won't. These folks don't have credit. They don't have identity. We need to bring those other 4 billion people online. And we need to do it in an efficient way that's not going to choke the planet. We can't give every one of them an automobile, right? We can't give every one of them the same access to the industrial complex that we've had. We have to change the notion of the industrial era to serve the entirety of those 8 to ultimately 10 billion people. And all this is part of this demographic shift that we spend so much time sort of laying the foundation for very early on in the book. Because if we don't address that, if we don't face that, and we don't talk about it enough as a society, I think, that this inevitability, and it's immutable. This is not going to change, by the way. We're not going to somehow put into place a policy that changes that demographic shift. This is immutable. It will happen. And we have to accept it and then build systems around it that will allow us to build a sustainable future. And that's why it's the very first gigatrend that we talk about.
And do you see, you talked about the that intersection of the life expectancy and work life expectancy. Are you expecting people to continue working late into, kind of like the death of retirement? They'll just keep working?
Yeah.
Or do you think they'll be, in 20, 30 years, they'll be retiring at 40 or 50 and having their AI persona pick up the work?
No, I don't. I think this is where, what a wonderful question. This is where I think we desperately get it wrong every single time some new technology promises to displace the current pinnacle that we occupy as human beings. So in the 1800s, that pinnacle would have been me and a plow horse. If you had told me you were going to take my plow horse away from me, I would have been devastated. What will I do? What value can I bring? The commodity value of humanity back then was in brawn, not in brain. They were smart people, but the commodity value of humanity was in brawn. If I was running a textile loom and you had told me that you were going to take that textile loom away from me, I would have picked up a sledgehammer as the Luddites did and smashed it, because I would have been so upset at the notion of automation. I don't want an automated textile loom. I want a human-driven textile loom because that creates better textiles. Today, we have the same fear around AI and robotics. But every single time, Nick, we have this fear, guess what? We create new value. We figure out new ways that human beings can create value that other human beings can consume. And we consistently fail to recognize the ability we have as humans to create new value that we want then to consume as humans. What we're doing right now, this podcast, is a great example of that, right? We've democratized the value of media through the internet and through these podcast platforms. So we create new value. We consistently are able to move up that food chain, but we are also consistently unable to foresee how we're going to move up that food chain. So I have no doubt that not only will we not retire, but we won't want to retire because we'll be able to do more of the things that we love to do. And maybe I'll work, I don't know, 5 or 10 hours a week. But I'll continue to work because it gives me joy. It allows me to be relevant. It allows me to contribute, to get value from that contribution. So I don't think we're going to take a back seat and suddenly, end up all in our lazy boys or our easy chairs watching Just Judy and Jeopardy 24/7. We will find ways to engage. There will be ways to engage that are much more pleasant than, frankly, the way we engage today. That farmer pulling that plowshare behind a plow horse, I think would have gladly have taken a automated or robotic approach if they had been given something else through which they could then create value and get joy out of their life. So as humans, I don't think we're going to take a back seat and just stop and let the AI do all the work. We will simply create new streams of value that humans are uniquely qualified to be able to create. AI will do the drudgery and the tedium for us and will give us the bandwidth to be able to do that. Every single technology, you can go back hundreds or thousands of years, has given us as humans more bandwidth through which to express our humanity and to create more value through the expression of that humanity, while the tool, or in this case, the agent, the AI, takes on more of those things that as humans we're not quite as interested in doing. That, I think, is the trajectory that we're on. And for me, it's an incredibly hopeful trajectory, because who doesn't want to do more of what they enjoy doing, of what gives them pleasure in life, of what allows them to be creative and expressive in their humanity. And I don't care what domain you apply that to. We can come up with examples, whether it's healthcare or transportation or any retail. It doesn't matter where we apply it. We can come up with examples of where the humans will end up being more human in what they do, and the robots and the AI will do the tedium and the drudgery and those things that as humans we frankly don't really want to be doing that much of.
Yep. And how about moving on to healthcare? I think that's probably the reason you put it sequentially after the population,
Yeah.
future population. Nice segue from that discussion into healthcare. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll keep going through
Sure.
the other trends. We'll get into future of work, transportation, identity, and then things. So let's pick up in the time we have. Let's look at healthcare, and then we'll go into
Sure.
future of work.
Yeah, so healthcare is one of those areas that in the U.S. we certainly obsess over, but I want to make sure this is not just a U.S. conversation. This is a global conversation. So the chapter on healthcare is predicated on two things: how we will address this aging demographic and the complexity of it, and this notion of ambient care. So let me quickly go over both of those. I've talked a bit about how this aging demographic is going to challenge healthcare. Most of our healthcare dollars are spent on that 65 and older population, and the older you get, the greater the percentage that we're spending on that particular piece of the population. In the last months or weeks of life, in many cases, we spend the majority of healthcare dollars for that individual are spent in those final months, years perhaps, depending on the illness of life, to extend life as much as we possibly can, not to extend health span, but to extend lifespan. Part of what we talk about in the book is the importance of extending health span and how we need to increasingly focus on the well-being of the patient and the individual so they can continue to get joy out of life, to do those things that they want to do in life, whatever that might be. And each of us has their list of what it is that gives us joy in life. The reason, and ambient care is critical to this philosophy, the reason that ambient care is critical is because today, in every healthcare system around the world, what we end up doing is focusing on healthcare in the clinic. So my healthcare is attended to when I'm there with my primary care, when I'm there in the emergency room, when I'm there in the clinical setting. The rest of my life, healthcare becomes sort of a back seat. I don't think about it until I absolutely need it. When the reality is that healthcare should follow me 24/7. Healthcare should be an ongoing process. There should be continuity of care rather than episodic care, which is what we provide today. Episodic care does not treat the prevention of illness. It does not diagnose and identify issues that could lead to more severe conditions. So the point we make in the book is that what we see is this increasing notion of ambient care where I am surrounded constantly by healthcare, which is monitoring me, which communicates through a digital advocate with my healthcare provider. The healthcare provider has an AI, if you will, that communicates with my digital advocate. And so that constant communication, I can identify whether there are biomarkers or behaviors that are leading to certain situations that will be more severe, more acute in the future. And that just doesn't exist today. But I know, because I'm working with companies that are doing this, that digital advocate is already being built. And we will have AI-driven digital advocates, each one of us that we own, that own our healthcare records, have complete history of our context. And if I walk into an ER and I am unable to tell that doctor, that clinician, that nurse what's going on, that digital advocate will be able to give him or her all the information they need to treat me in context, not as an episodic, anonymous patient, but as a patient who they have knowledge of, who they have history of, and who they can then treat as an entire holistic human being, rather than just one slice of the sliver of what they know about me, given on my biomarkers at that particular point in time. That's a fascinating way to think about healthcare, and we're doing it. You know, my smartphone, your Apple Watch, all these devices are creating this ambient mesh of healthcare. The problem is that it's not all interconnected just yet, but it will be. I mean, keep an eye out for what folks like Epic and Cerner, especially Cerner through Oracle, are doing. Ellison is on the bandwagon to create a healthcare record that truly is an ambient healthcare record that fully is available to me, tracks my behaviors and my biomarkers to create this digital advocate. Amazon is trying to do it. And when people say to me, yeah, but Amazon's failed, of course, and they'll fail 10 more times, but they won't on the 11th. The tech vendors, whether it be Google, whether it be Amazon, whether it be Apple, will continue to innovate in this space, and we will create what I believe is truly a healthcare system that is fully ambient, fully aware, and fully able to act on my behalf when I cannot. It's a fascinating view of the future, and it's not the long future, Nick. This is a 10-year future. The companies that I'm working with right now that are doing this, that I'm advising, that I'm on boards for, they're looking at a 5 to 10 year horizon to begin rolling these digital advocate technologies out. Sorely needed.
Yeah, and I think there's probably some of the sports tech companies like Garmin
Right.
Probably have an interesting opportunity there too, because
Absolutely.
I have a watch for triathlon, and it records my VO2 max and a lot of data, a lot of heart related data that's kind of a little bit above and beyond the traditional smartwatch.
Yeah.
And so indicators like VO2 max are really good for predicting your current health and fitness level and things like that, or resting heart rate. So it's amazing, just if we collect those kind of indicators, it's amazing how that can inform even our long-term health prospects. Yeah.
Well, we're good at collecting them right now. What we're not so good at is integrating them into a single continuous healthcare process, and that's the next step.
Yeah.
Is how do we integrate those so that all these biomarkers, whether it be VO2 max or whether it be blood pressure or heart rate or whatever it might happen to be, that they all are available and accessible to me, to my provider, in a way that allows me to make decisions based on these that are more than just anecdotal, but are central to my healthcare. That a really ambient system is a fully connected, interconnected system as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. And how about the future of work? What are you seeing there, or what are you predicting in the book?
So in the book, we talk a lot about digital workers. I think we are entering an era here where you will be able to hire a digital worker the same way that you'll hire a human being by going to Indeed or whatever job board, online job board you want to go to. Digital workers will become full-time collaborators. They will become team members. And the catalyst to that is not generative AI. It's not the large language models. It'll be part of that, but it's agentic AI. So the move to use AI to do more than just a task, but to give it a goal and to allow it to make decisions, to use applications and resources and data to achieve that goal is the critical piece of agent-based AI. If I look at, and I've got a wonderful chart, but I'll try to just explain this visually. If I look at the impact of AI so far, it's very incremental. We see AI as being this extraordinary technology, but the impact so far has been very incremental. The real impact, the quantum leap, the creation of a new source of value through AI will be through agentic AI. It'll be AI as an agent where I tell the AI, you know what, my profit margins look kind of slim. It's not clear to me whether we should be cutting costs at this point or changing the product mix or introducing a new product. Take a look at what we're doing. Look at our customers in the marketplace. Give me some scenarios that I can use to build an organization that'll be more viable in the future. Wow. I mean, you can say that to a large language model. What you'd come back with is a bunch of text. And agentic AI could actually go in and make decisions to change the business, change the way the business operates. It would have access to much more data about the business than any LLM ever could. And it would be given authority. As the name implies, it would have agency. If I told you, Nick, I want you to take a look at this product line and restructure it so that we can do better in 2025, you'd be making a lot of decisions. You'd be given a lot of responsibility. The same thing will be happening with AI over the course of the next 12 to 24 months. And agentic AI, I think, will be the real value proposition for AI, well beyond anything that we've seen so far. And those agentic AIs will be digital workers, and we'll communicate with them just the way that you and I are right now. Yesterday, I was doing some HTML coding. I used to be a coder way back when, going back 40 years. And I had a conversation with my AI where I said, no, bold this row in this column, change the margins, inset the image, and it would create the HTML through that conversation. I was programming, but I was programming by giving it objectives rather than getting into the HTML myself. That kind of conversational AI is what a digital worker is. They'll be a team member, fully fledged, and just as competent to do certain tasks as many humans are. It creates some interesting repercussions. Entry-level positions will start to go away. Universities will have to rethink who they're graduating and what positions they're graduating people for. Accounting, finance, those entry-level positions are going to be few and far between. We're already seeing that. So there will be some social implications here. We could talk more about that, but there will be social implications here. There's no doubt, because it'll happen very, very quickly. But at the same time, going back to my earlier point, we'll create new streams of value and redeploy people to deliver that new value. But it is going to be very disruptive, because the digital workers will take on almost all entry-level positions across virtually all industries. You and I were talking about Optimus earlier and robots, humanoid robots. Those will have enormous impact in serving us in a lot of areas where today are labor intensive. So there'll be a lot of disruption as a result of entry-level positions, apprenticeships going away. We'll have to deal with that. But long term, I'm hopeful that we will find new ways to create value.
Great. Okay. And the next trend was transportation. So give us a bit of insight there. and
Yeah.
tell us where you think the trend line is around.
Yeah, we love, what's fascinating to me about autonomous vehicles, we talk a lot about those, and transportation as a service, as we describe it in that chapter. We talk a lot about that, but we also love to diss it. We also love to poo-poo the idea of truly autonomous vehicles. I don't go a day without hearing someone say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. We're never going to have fully autonomous vehicles. It's not going to happen again." And I'm amazed at the degree to which we are so convinced that we can't do it. I was talking to someone just yesterday about how in California by 2035, the edict is to have all EVs, and most of those EVs will be autonomous more than likely. There's a federal government edict for federal vehicles by 2035. In the book, we actually reference a study that we did at Delphi Group some years ago that predicted well before any of these edicts were in place that 2035 would be sort of that cusp year where things would start to change dramatically and we would move to autonomous vehicles. Here are the facts. The facts are that we cannot continue to grow the population of user-driven vehicles at the rate we have been in order to serve these other 4 billion, because they'll need transportation as well. We'll choke the planet. I mean, we don't have the resources, and the carbon footprint that transportation creates is enormous. We can't double that footprint over the course of the next 20, 30 years. That would be insanity. So what we project in the book is that autonomous vehicles are critical and necessary because by utilizing EVs more hours during the day, what you actually do is decrease the carbon footprint. You end up with a more efficient vehicle, certainly not a piece of iron sitting in your driveway for 20 hours out of the 24 hours in the day. But you increase utilization, you increase efficiency, and as a result, you'd get away from this user-driven, user-owned model of the automobile. And I absolutely believe that it's not only possible, but it's necessary that we do that. And we can't continue with this one vehicle per person kind of policy that we've had in the developed world any longer. It's just not, it's not sustainable. So we look at transportation as a service, and the notion of EVs and autonomous vehicles and AVs quickly, certainly by 2050, having replaced everything that we today think of as sort of the common landscape of user-owned vehicles. You won't be able to insure a human driver, I would project, by 2040, certainly not by 2050. Insurance companies won't underwrite a human driver. It'll just be too damn expensive because these autonomous vehicles will be so much less risky than human drivers are. And by the way, the other thing we point out in the book is that vehicles won't just be for transportation. They'll be for entertainment. They'll be for physical fitness. They'll be for socialization. And if you look at the way that these autonomous vehicles are being built, not only do they not have a steering wheel, but they're built to sort of accommodate the individual in ways that we're not accustomed to a vehicle accommodating us. And there's a lot of talk about how autonomous vehicles can end up being vehicles for entertainment, for getting together with friends. And all this sounds very perverse right now because it's not what we're accustomed to. But I really do believe that we're going to see an entirely different modality for transportation than we have. And frankly, we can't continue the current modality and sustain it and survive it more directly at this current trajectory. So it's a fascinating way, again, in which a gigatrend is going to fundamentally alter the way we think about something like transportation. And we will look back and we'll wonder, how in the world did we put our 16-year-old kids in front of the wheel of an automobile? How dangerous was that? How ridiculous was that? How crazy was it to have an automobile that sat there for 20 hours a day doing nothing? A lot of these behaviors that today we take for granted will seem completely absurd in just 20, 30 years' time.
And we'll get into a lot of interesting kind of tactical scenarios, but things that are kind of interesting, like cars that return themselves if you haven't paid the monthly loan, or a car that takes itself to get the oil change. It realizes it's time for the oil change and off it goes, right? Well, so there'll be some interesting things there.
What about a car that owns itself? It's not my car. It owns itself. It's on the blockchain. It owns itself. It turns itself in for parts when its life is over. we talk about the likelihood of cars that own themselves. And again, it sounds ridiculous, but you know what? Several hundred years ago, the idea of a corporation, a corpus that had legal entity and legal stature, that had legal liability, was also absurd. And yet, the corporate structure is part of society. We couldn't survive without that corporate structure. It has liability. It has responsibility. Why couldn't a car similarly own itself and have legal corpus? I think this is only absurd because it's not what we are accustomed to.
Great. And how about moving on to the last two trends that we have? How about the future of identity? And then we'll close off with the future of things. But let's spend a little bit of time on identity and where you see that going. Obviously, that's kind of an anchor point for everything. So, where do you see that? Where do you see that going?
The identity chapter is one of the densest chapters in the book. We really get into a lot of the details of how identity will change going forward. But at the core of all of that is this notion I brought up earlier, that we have 4 billion people on the planet today that don't really have identity. They can't open up a bank account. They can't get credit. They're taken advantage of because of that fact. They have no real financial or economic incentive to participate in the rest of society. They're very much sort of the least observed and appreciated part of humanity, and yet they're 4 billion human beings. And we take very seriously in the book this notion of the other 4 billion, because I think one of the greatest tasks we have ahead of us over the course of the next 80 years as we head to 2100 is how do we give dignity to these 4 billion, what will be 5 billion people as we reach peak, capacity of 10 billion people on the planet. And the answer to that is that we simply have not focused on them. They have been an anonymous part of society. It is disillusioning and disheartening to see how much they are taken advantage of, and the degree to which they are not acknowledged, and their dignity is not something that we take serious. And I think that has to change. And I'm talking from a very deep philosophical standpoint here. I think as a society, we have to consider that. So in the chapter about identity, we talk about, in very tactical terms, how do you do that? How do you give identity to these individuals? And the answer is, we've already figured it out. Estonia has a cradle to grave identity that you have. You're on the blockchain the minute you're born. We have the technologies with which to not just provide identity, but to create an immutability to identity that allows you, as De Soto, the famous Peruvian economist De Soto once said, the whole structure of a civilized economy, a truly free market driven economy and society, is ownership. You can't have ownership if you don't have identity. The two are inextricably linked. So the point that we bring up in the chapter is that identity is critical to bringing on board these other 4 billion people, to giving them the option of ownership, assets, rights, whether they be digital rights or physical rights to things that have value, and through that to become part of the global socio-economic infrastructure. And I do believe by doing that, Nick, we'll bring up on board another 4 to 5 billion brains that can be part of that creative process, that can add value the way, the 4 billion that you and I belong to add value today. What an incredible future that would be. The other piece of identity is that today, even for you and I, our identity is not as intricately woven into all those things that we should own. So my digital identity is owned by Apple, by Meta, by Google, by Amazon. It's not owned by me. So I should have ownership rights over my digital identity and be able to monetize it in the same way that, if I write a book, if anyone uses a piece of this book, it gets monetized. I mean, there are mechanisms by which that happens today. I get a royalty check when someone takes a paragraph out of it or a quote out of it and uses it in an article or some other piece. We should be able to do the same thing transactionally with those things that we own. And we should all be able to do that. All human beings should have that right, that birthright. But especially for you and I, all we do is create content and knowledge. That is the entire basis of our value proposition to the world. And today, it's not clear to me that we fully have the capability to extract value from that exchange of information and content. We're moving in that direction, but I think, again, ownership at a very low level of granularity, using blockchain or technologies like blockchain to give me immutable ownership over these assets that I create will be absolutely critical. Could be my healthcare record too. It doesn't have to necessarily be, a piece of literature that I create. My healthcare record has value to me. Today, it's being monetized by a lot of people, and I don't even know that it's being monetized necessarily. That healthcare data we were talking about on your Apple Watch or whatever healthcare device you happen to use. If you're a 23andMe subscriber, what happens to that data when someone purchases the organization? So a lot of this information that should belong to me, that I should have ownership of, I don't necessarily have true ownership of, and identity is part of that equation. So a lot to be done here as we build this new society that is predicated on this notion of having identity and having immutable ownership to these assets, these digital assets that we create, and that ultimately will become more valuable. And this segues to the last chapter, becomes more valuable than my physical assets. Could there be a point in time where my digital assets have greater value than my physical assets? And the answer in the book that we propose is absolutely. We're a stone's throw away from that.
And if we, I think much of the identity discussion, I'm kind of working my way through the chapter. You talk about Web 2 business models versus Web 3. If we do go to the Web 3 model, where there's just kind of one official authoritative identity for that person, right, versus 500 all over the place, who should, it kind of triggers the question, who should own that, and have, who's on point for managing that blockchain or whatever that might be.
Right.
Is that a national thing, a global thing?
Well, nations,
or does it all come back to the individual, and they're fully responsible for that?
Nations. So here we encounter a very interesting conversation and a predicament that we often find ourselves in, which is we use the models of the past to predict the trajectory of the future. So what you just said is predicated on how this would have been done up until now. A nation would have owned it. An organization would have owned it. There would have been centralized ownership. Why do we need that going forward? Blockchain is not centralized. There is no ownership per se. It is decentralized. And this decentralized model, I think, will become such a part of how we look at the future. Who owns the automobile? I own it. Who produces the automobile? GM or Ford. When you have self-owned automobiles, what does that look like? How does that decentralized model fit into the scheme that you and I have grown up with? It doesn't, is the answer. So the notion of central banks, the notion of centralized authorities, I think will be significantly challenged, as I believe it will have to be going forward. So my answer to your question is that if we think of it in conventional terms that we are accustomed to, a nation would own it and manage it. There'd be centralized authorities that would be given the rights to be able to manage it. 800 numbers are given. The government gives rights to an organization to hand out 800 numbers, and the government will give rights to an organization to hand out identities. That's a short-term issue. Long-term, it is owned by me. It is owned by the individual. It is highly decentralized, and we have faith in the decentralized mechanism such that we will allow that to happen. We don't have that faith yet in blockchain. When I say blockchain, what most people think about is cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and Ethereum and what have you, and Dogecoin. It doesn't give us a whole lot of faith and trust in that. But that trust will develop. It absolutely will develop. I have no doubt about that. And as it does, and we talk about this in the book, as we get to the 2030s, 40s, and 50s, we will see that trust evolve. And I have no doubt by 2050 or 2060, at the very, very outset, at the outermost point of this conversation, we will have fully adopted this notion of individual ownership on the blockchain of much of both our digital and our physical assets. Okay,
great. And so the final question today, moving to the kind of the sixth gigatrend.
Yeah.
And this will be Actually, I do have a couple more questions before we wrap up, but which I think are going to be very insightful when we hear your answer. So I do have two questions lined up. But before I get to the two final ones, can you talk a little bit about the future of things? And that's kind of the
So,
sixth gigatrend in the book.
right. So we already began going down that path in our conversation just a few minutes ago. I do believe we are entering an era where increasingly the value of digital assets is approaching and will exceed the value of physical assets. Certainly for us as individuals and for organizations. That's a very difficult thing for most folks to wrap their head around. It's hard to believe that that could ever possibly be the case. And the reason is because we are physical beings. We touch and feel and smell and see things that surround us, and those things have value. And it's tough to imagine an era where a digital equivalent of that could possibly exist. But let me make this a bit more sort of real. Think about what I was saying earlier, that there will be this digital avatar of me that can continue after I'm gone. Just let's play with this just a little bit. Imagine that this digital avatar is not just the collection of everything that I've done, all my books that I've written, my thousands of ink articles, my podcasts and conversations, but it has observed my behaviors and my decisions in such a way that it truly becomes capable of playing life the same way that AlphaGo Zero can play Go. In other words, it is so in tune to the way that I approach the world, the way that I make decisions, that it could make decisions for me that would be as good, and maybe in some cases even better, than the decisions I might make in that same moment. It's difficult to embrace that. I understand. It sounds a bit science fictional, but we're going out to 2080, 2100. Why not see how far this could take us? If I could build that entity, well, I could claim that every single thing I do today, every decision I make that results in greater value, greater wealth, greater success, however you want to measure the productivity of an individual, those decisions are based on my knowledge. If I have an entity that can make those similar decisions, does that entity not have as much value potentially as I have? And I know I'm treading on sacred ground here, because now the question becomes, well, what value do you have, Tom? Why is it zero sum? Why can't I have something else that collaborates with me in this life that has equivalent value to me, that I can work with as a collaborator to create even more value? And why can't that entity continue beyond me? And to that point, here's what's going to get really freaky for a lot of folks. To that point, I have trusts and wills and all these things all put in place for when I eventually pass away. And I bequeath in those various documents certain assets that I have today. What if one of those assets was this digital self? And I bequeath that to my children so that they can have an ongoing conversation with me. I can make decisions on their behalf or with them in collaboration with them. That's a hugely valuable asset. And if you question that, stop. Because if I were to say to you, I could grant you immortality, would that not have value? Would you not be able to continue over time to take that wisdom and create even more value from it? Of course. Who would say no to that? Well, guess what? I just granted you that. So this digital asset, this digital you, this digital self is an enormously valuable piece of who I am. It creates through its decisions the value that I would otherwise create. And there's no way you can debate for a moment that that particular asset would not have at least as much, and I would claim much more value than all the physical assets that I have at this point in time to my name. It's a fascinating way to think about the way the future might evolve. And again, this is not a 2030, 2040, 2050 discussion. This is a 2080, 2100 discussion. But there is no doubt in my mind that we will end up there, and that frankly, it'll be a fascinating way to think about the way value shifts from the physical world to the digital world. Knowledge workers have value. Why can't my surrogate have that same value? And the answer is it absolutely can.
And that was one of that prediction about the personal assistant.
Yeah.
was one of the things that really caught my attention in the book. I'm kind of looking over here. That's where the book is, but
Yeah.
um, it really caught my attention because we read so many of these predictions, and usually they're very bland, and they just tell us what we already know.
Right.
And the first one I read in the book, it just floored me, and I said, "Gee, that's kind of an interesting prediction." And
Yeah.
I started reading it, and it started talking about digital assistants, and that's the usual thread. But where
Right.
you took it was really interesting about leaving, you're leaving part of your will, your estate, to
Yeah.
that personal digital assistant. So that
Right.
took it to a whole new level in terms of a prediction. And I think readers of the book, I think you'll find a lot of hidden gems in there, as I've been discovering really on every page. So wrapping up, I do have two questions for you. I'm very curious about, as you are working on the book, what kind of shocked you the most? Because I know
Mm.
as authors, we're kind of learning as we go, and we do our research before we start writing, or in parallel, we're constantly pulling in data points for the book.
Sure.
But what did you come across or start to realize that shocked you the most as you put the book together?
I think what shocked me the most, and it was really the first time, this is book 14. It's the first time I've encountered this with any of my books. The speed with which a lot of these gigatrends were moving forward was so much faster than I had anticipated. And it was in each of these cases, I mean, to a T, in every single one of these cases, whether it was transportation or identity or healthcare or the impact of demographics, it was moving so fast. And the undercurrent with all of this obviously was AI. I mean, we had predicted in the book that we'd have a GPT-5 equivalent by the end of this year, beginning of next year. That pretty much is where we're going to be at. We had predicted the number of parameters that an LLM would have. That was fairly easy, and it didn't take a whole lot of brain power to do that, frankly. Just a little bit of a little bit of a leap of faith. But what amazes me is the degree to which AI as an undercurrent is fueling all of these gigatrends and is giving us the ability to address some of the challenges that we had raised. For example, in healthcare, in identity, in transportation, in the dematerialization of things. In each of these cases, AI is becoming such an incredible influence and accelerant to how we move forward and how these gigatrends evolve. So remember, in the very beginning, we talked about how gigatrends have this impact that lasts not just for months or years or decades, but centuries. I think with the advent of AI, what we will see is that these gigatrends will evolve much faster than they ever have in the past. That'll challenge us as human beings. It'll challenge us, as I said earlier, from a workforce standpoint. Does universal basic income play a role here? I think it absolutely has to play a role here, because there'll be that level of disruption. So a lot of that was surprising in terms of the speed with which things were developing. It wasn't surprising in terms of the trajectory. We knew we'd get there, but not as quickly as it seems to be the case lately, and increasingly, I think, through 2025. I think 25 will be a pivotal year. I mean, in so many ways, in no small part, because it'll finally be the year during which AI truly achieves that level of Turing test brilliance, where we can have this kind of a conversation, the kind we're having right now. I would suggest to your listeners and viewers here, if you haven't used Notebook LM, Google's AI, take it for a test drive. If you give it a piece of information, a book, an article, it can create a podcast just like this, without the visual, but from an audio standpoint, a podcast just as good as this. Some would claim maybe even better than this from that body of work. So we are at that point where we will truly blow past the Turing test and have AI that is fully capable of having these conversations with us. And I think that's going to force us to sort of really rethink deeply what the value is that we bring as humans. It's challenging, but I think it's a good thing, because when we answer that question, we enter a new era of value creation. We enter a new era of humanity that I think serves us much better as a species than the past one did. One would claim that dragging plow horses behind a horse didn't serve humanity very well. And I think 20, 30, 40 years into the future, we will look back on today and say, wow, the things we were doing back then didn't serve us as humanity very well. We constantly elevate the game. We increase our humanity through that creation of new value. And that's always, always a good thing. But it's also always a painful thing.
Great. Okay. And the final question, which companies are you seeing that are really good at this? And they, you kind of, with your knowledge of the Gigatrends and your co-author's knowledge, as you look across the tech landscape or even the non-tech landscape, what companies are you seeing that kind of you think, oh, they seem to get it. They seem to be working on some of these, one or more of these Gigatrends, and you think they may be successful in harnessing them. And then also the challenge to you also is, can you give a couple of examples? I know there's a couple of obvious ones, but I'm curious if there's any surprises in there as well as the usual suspects.
Yeah, there's not many surprises. I think we all have a pretty good sense for the landscape here. The large tech players are all playing and betting heavily in this, whether it's Microsoft or Google or Amazon, and there are unholy alliances here. So when I talk about OpenAI, I'm also talking about Microsoft. Obviously, when I talk about Anthropic, I'm talking about Amazon. The list goes on and on. It's a highly incestuous and interconnected marketplace. So the developments that are happening rapidly, and all the conventional players, I'll include Apple in that, are all playing heavily, investing heavily in the development of AI. Where I find the surprises and much more of my day-to-day interest being drawn are the smaller players that we haven't heard about. Companies like HeyGen, Heygen, that create these visual avatars where you can train it for 2 minutes using video of yourself, and then it will create a fully functional digital avatar. 11 Labs that's doing some really cool stuff with mimicking my voice. And while all of this, not mimicking my voice, actually being my voice, while all of this can also be used for nefarious purposes, deep fakes and what have you, it's fascinating to think about how we really are just a stone's throw away from creating a fully functional digital version of you and I that can have relevant, novel, curious conversations. So I see a lot of, in the nooks and crannies, I see a lot of application of this technology in ways that I find fascinating. Some of the companies that I'm advising and working with that are building digital advocates in healthcare. So a lot's happening just below the surface, not deep below the surface, but just below the surface that we don't see day to day. If I can provide a surprise here, and it's not so much in terms of a surprise in terms of the trajectory of what's going to happen, but in terms of what I see so much happening just below the surface that I believe we are at a point where there's going to be an eruption of point solutions and applications of AI in all of these areas that we've talked about in ways that will seem to overwhelm us very suddenly. And I think we're in a 12 to 24 month time frame. When I look at investment in these companies, when I look at where they are in terms of their products and their development, and I do believe by the time we get to the end of this decade, AI will be pervasive in every aspect of what we do in ways that we can barely begin to imagine, and will begin to solve these issues, these tremendous challenges that we face in healthcare, in these complex demographic shifts that we've been talking about, in identity, in transportation, in robotics, in digital work, so much of that. And I think the period between 2030 and 2035 will be one of the most fascinating 5-year periods in the history of civilization, because we will just have reached that apex. A lot of this will be deployed. A lot of the technology I see being invested in will be fully mature, and we will begin to leverage AI in a way that will fundamentally alter civilization and our trajectory in ways that we can barely begin to imagine today. I'm so excited. I just want to be here long enough to see that happen. But I think that is the sweet spot. If I think about the turning point. In the same way that in the last century, the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing really began to take off in that the second quarter of the century. I think we'll see something very similar to that in this century. It'll be marvelous, magnificent. It's a bit terrifying. It creates a bit of anxiety. But again, we don't grow when the butterflies and the rainbows are out. We grow when we're challenged, and we will certainly be challenged to rethink and reimagine what this world is like and how we'll move into the future, how we will move into the future.
Great. So, Tom Koulopoulos, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Nick. Such a pleasure to have these deep and interesting conversations with you, full of curiosity. I really appreciate the opportunity.